Good evening, everybody. This is Chess Openings Explained, and I'm your instructor, Nick Risco. I'm one of the private lesson instructors here at the St. Louis Chess Club. And tonight we're going to be going over the Rasalimo attack in the Sicilian. So I want to give a shout out to Fred in the chat asking us to cover the Sicilian. This is one of the lines in the Sicilian. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, just ask right away in the chat. If it's about a specific move or a specific line, please put a move number. That way I can better understand what your question is in reference to. So for those of you who don't know, we're going to go to the chessboard here. The Sicilian starts off with e4 and c5, and we actually covered a branch in the Sicilian last week, the pin variation. The idea with e4, c5 is that white is going to get some rapid development, and black is going to be prepared to trade off the c pawn in the center for better center control. Now here, white, probably their best shot for winning chances is going to be knight to f3, and black can go knight to c6. And here, it can lead to probably the Sveshnikov positions, where white will play d4, captures, knight f6, knight c3, and e5, and then knight d to b5. And these positions can be very sharp and can get very confusing if you haven't done your homework. And some players may think this is too sharp and want to avoid this. So instead of playing d4, what we're going to be covering tonight is probably the best theoretical sideline to d4. Bishop to b5. This is the Nizet, Minov, Rasalimo attack. And like I said, it's been claimed to be the best theoretical alternative to the open variations. And it's pretty logical as well. You develop the light square bishop, so white is ready to castle on the king side. And your pawn structure, you haven't committed to anything yet, so it's very flexible. And the point of aiming at c6 is that you're putting your bishop there in such a way that you can inflict double pawns on black. I want to mention very quickly that pawn to d6 and then bishop to b5 check is not the Rasalimo variation. I just want to clarify this one. This is the Moscow variation, which there can be some transpositions if black goes d6 on move 3, but this is not going to be our main focus tonight. So again, knight to c6 and then bishop to b5. This is the proper Rasalimo attack. And here, there are quite a few ways that black can respond actually, and I'm still wondering if we're going to get through all of them tonight. But we'll start with some of the lesser known moves. Starting off with one that has shown up recently, not in a game, but actually in the show The Queen's Gambit, where the first time Beth Harmon is playing Borgov, Borgov plays the Rasalimo, and then Beth goes queen to b6. So I figured I should at least cover this move since it made that appearance. And I really couldn't find some refutation for queen b6 being a bad move, though it isn't the most played, but it will show some ideas that white has. First, we'll look at what happens if white captures on c6 anyway. This is going to be one of the main ideas, and here, instead of taking back with a pawn, which is probably why black plays queen b6 in the first place, is they recapture with the queen, and they avoid the doubled pawns, but they're losing some time by moving the queen more than once in the opening. And now white can castle, and black should probably play d6 here. They can try taking on e4, but after rook to e1, queen to c6, and pawn to d4, I guess pawn to d6, trying to open lines up for your pieces, and pawn to c4, white stands a bit better here because of the center. It's not like black has damaged it at all, and you have the knight developed. The rook is in the center, your queen is ready to come up if needed, your bishop's ready to come out, and black still has quite a bit of work, especially on this dark square bishop. So they should try and go d6 earlier rather than going for the center pawn. And now pawn to d4, they can trade in the center, and now queen takes e4 because you're putting pressure on this knight. If white isn't careful, they can't just move the queen to f3 trying to trade queens. Queen takes d4. So knight c3 hits the queen, queen to g4, and avoiding the queen trade, go queen to d3. And white stands better here. They're down a pawn, but they have all the development with the knights, that should compensate for it. The other option white has instead of taking on c6 is you can play knight to c3, just developing the bishop, and this move is a bit more popular, and I think I like it more because it's developing another piece, and the e4 pawn doesn't hang in some of these lines. Black will continue with e6 rather than d6 here, and the point of e6 is you're trying to prepare d5. White will castle. Another point of playing e6 is the knight comes to e7 to support the other knight. So again, if white ever captures on c6, knight recaptures and you don't have doubled pawns. Pawn to d3, just reinforcing e4. Now pawn to a6, kicking the bishop. And here, in this line where black has not put the bishop on g7 or played d5, you can actually get away with saving the bishop. So bishop a4 has been played here. A lot of the times you'll see take, but I think after takes, after probably just knight takes, I don't think white is significantly better here. You can just save the bishop, go to a4, knight to g6, and now that the knight has gone to g6, it can make some sense to capture on c6 and force the queen to move. You don't get the knight coming to its natural square on c6 where it can jump in on d4 in the future. And now after queen retakes, you have pawn to a4 and pawn to b6, just kind of helping out this c-pawn here. Black can try for d5. They're going to go like bishop e7 or bishop d6 to castle short. But this position is also pretty equal. Like I said, I can't really find a great line that punishes queen b6. It's just that it's a little bit slow for black because they make a lot of queen moves. But that is the queen b6 line. Like I said, I figured I should just mention it because it's popped up recently. The other, I guess, minor line that we're going to cover here is knight to f6. This is like the third most popular move after g6 and e6. So this also deserves attention. And here, white should go knight to c3, reinforcing e4, also supporting the bishop in case of any future queen to b6 moves. And here, black can play, it looks like one of two moves, unless I'm getting my notes mixed up again. They can try and go g6. g6 has been played before. The game I have referenced here is from 1996, where white can go e5 and hit the knight right away. Your knight goes to g4. You're threatening to take on e5, so bishop takes c6 is almost forced. And now d takes c6. I should note, black doesn't want to take with the b pawn here. Contrary to what scholastic players might know, capture towards the center, you want to capture towards the outside to open up a path for your bishop, open up paths for your queen, not d5 specifically because of the knight, but you want to make sure that you're helping the development of your pieces instead of hurting it. If you go with the b pawn, if you go bishop to a6 in the future, d3 might hurt this bishop because it's supported by the pawn on c2, and a6 may not look like a great diagonal. The a6 to f1 diagonal, probably not going to be the best for black. So you capture towards the outside with your d pawn. You can kick the knight away. Knight goes to h6, knight to e4, and is getting ready to jump in on d6 or f6 if black isn't careful. Pawn to b6, supporting the c5 pawn that's under attack. Queen to e2, knight f5, pawn to c3, bishop g7 and g4, hitting the knight. Hopefully these moves don't need too much understanding. They're just kind of filler moves, but here white does have a little bit of an advantage here. The knight is forced to go to h6, and white can expand in the center with d4. So g6 is one possible move, but I think white does get to expand in the center pretty early. One move that might look good, but is a little dubious, is knight to d4. This is a move that is found in some variations of the, actually the bird variation of the Ruy Lopez, where the knight goes to d4, looking to trade off minor pieces. And if you're playing white, don't get tempted and trade off the knights right away, because your knight on c3 is going to be hit, and it doesn't seem like there's a great place to put it. You can try going to d5, but you hang your e4 pawn. So don't take on d4. Here, it's okay to give up your bishop. After all, one of the main ideas is to trade the bishop for the knight in the first place, and here black is just spending time to have you do it anyway. So you can go with a move like pawn to e5, and now after captures, knight to d5, you have a strong move here, knight to g5, kind of ignoring some opening principles. You're moving pieces more than once out of the opening. But here is a bit tricky to find the correct move for black. If you try something like, if you try f6, trying to kick the knight away, you're still going to be fine. White can castle, or knight e4. I think knight e4 is the move I have. Pawn to f5, pawn to c4, offering a trade of knights, and knight to c7. This is going to be a move we see repeated in the future. Instead of the knight jumping forward, it's going to go back to c7. And then knight takes c5. Here, white has a little bit of an advantage after the knight's trade, d6, ed6, ed6, knight a4, hopping to the edge where it's supported by the queen. You don't really want to go to d3 and block your d-pawn. That's going to trap your bishop forever. Okay, not forever, but for a few moves. Queen e7, queen e2, takes, bishop e7, and white has a bit of a better endgame. d4 is going to come to open up the bishop. Your knight is already, he's not great, but he's already out. He's off the back row. But white should have a little bit of an advantage here. Okay, so if f6, if white gets a better endgame, what if we try pawn to f5? This is a move that has been recommended in some books, where white can castle, pawn to a6, and move the knight to c3. And the idea is that you're going to trade off the knights here. But I'm not really sure about this. White does get to open up their center for their bishop to develop. And it's still a little difficult to find out where the best square for this dark square bishop in the future is going to be. Now, for the rest of this example, black's not going to play the best moves, but like this position here is already still good for white. But some idea could be queen to b6. This has been tried before. And I wanted to demonstrate that here you have the move pawn to e6, where you're giving up this pawn. This is an idea that we've seen AlphaZero play against Stockfish, where they just push the pawns up for positional compensation. And the idea behind this is that if the pawn takes, this dark square bishop is going to struggle in the long term. The only way to really develop it is going to be playing pawn to g6 and bishop to g7. And even this diagonal isn't great because white had made that capture on c3, and now there's the two pawns staring at the bishop. So bishop f4, just making sure the center pawns can't expand and black can't get the bishop to e7. Pawn to g6, bishop to e5, now preventing bishop to g7 and rook to g8. And white is already doing great here after knight takes h7. You're already winning a pawn. So f5 can be very dangerous for black. Like I said, queen b6 not the best move, but even before queen b6, the position is still favorable towards white. If you're not going to move your f-pawn at all, then h6 is going to be another try, but h6 is probably worse than either of the f-pawn moves because of a knight f7 sacrifice. If knight takes f7, you have to take the knight. If you try something like queen b6, trying to save your queen, then you're giving up this rook on h8. So you have to take it, otherwise you're losing material. And now queen to f3 looks very dangerous. You're hitting the knight, you're hitting the king. The only move is knight to f6. You're saving your knight. The pawn is going to take it, but if you're going to lose it anyway, might as well get a pawn out of it. And now e takes or g takes is fine, but I've decided to choose e takes for our examples tonight. Queen to d5 check, and the critical move here for black is to make sure that you go king to g6. If you put the king on the e-file, it's going to be met by white castling, and rook e1 is unstoppable. So king to g6 is the only safe move for black. White castles anyway, again, trying to get this rook into the game. Queen to b6, hitting the knight. And instead of just moving the knight to c3, that can be a little passive, because then black can continue with development. You go queen d3 check, hitting the queen and saving the knight. And here, the king has to go to f7. The only other try is pawn to f5, which there's no immediate punishment, but white is still going to enjoy good development after rook e1. So king to f7, king is still safe here. Pawn to b3, you're looking to get the bishop developed. Queen to c6, pawn to c4, pawn to b6, knight to c3. So you get this pawn up to c4 before you move the knight back. Bishop b7, and now you have to be careful because there is a mate threat. Queen takes g2 is checkmate, you can't allow it. So you have to go knight d5 blocking it. And here rook e8, and black is still holding on, but there are a series of critical moves they need to find. That way they don't get checkmated very early on. In the chat, Sandro Schock is asking, is it advisable to take AlphaZero's principles in practice, or is it just too dangerous to go for positional compensation and as an amateur player? As far as amateurs using it, I mean, I'm going to define amateur as about 1500. Probably not, because odds are you're going to hang a piece later, and if you're down a pawn and then go down a piece later, there's no coming back. If you're, master level, it's something to take a look at, be familiar with. I mean, we see the top GMs training with AlphaZero, specifically Magnus, to learn these principles. So I think it's something you should familiarize yourself with, but I wouldn't be too liberal with using the idea. So, good question. Okay, so that was the knight d4 line here for black. Like I said, probably not the best line, not the best try. So what black should probably do here is, we looked at g6, we looked at knight to d4, but queen c7 is another serious try and a little bit more theory to this move than the others. White should continue with normal development by castling. And now if black tries knight to d4, this kind of works now because the queen is a little bit more active. But you can still go rook to e1. And the idea is if they take on b5, you take with the knight and you're hitting the queen, so you're going to get a little tempo off of that. So black isn't advised to take the bishop. They should play a6 and hit the bishop right away. And now an idea to be familiar with is dropping the bishop back. Again, if black hasn't made any serious commitments to their pawn structure, it's still a little flexible, just drop the bishop back, try and save it, because there's not a guarantee where the weaknesses in black's position are going to be. Okay, so after bishop to f1, black has two tries here. We'll start with an interesting try of pawn to e5, just clamping down the center. White can't expand. Black never needs to worry about white playing pawn to e5. And here, white can go knight to d5, looking for a trade of pieces. Knight takes, pawn takes. Now black needs to be careful about this half-open file. White does have a lot of pressure on it. So bishop to d6, protecting. You can try pawn to d6, but I feel like black is falling a little bit too far behind in development here. The idea with protecting with the bishop is that way you also open yourself up to castle on the very next move. We can see knight takes e5, and this works tactically because if bishop takes e5, it is met with pawn to f4. So they can't take the knight right away. They have to castle. And now after castling, white should play pawn to f4, protecting this knight, and they're going to enjoy what looks to be an extra pawn, but black is starting to get some piece activity and really make a fight in the center. Pawn to f6 hitting the knight, knight goes to d3, making sure it protects f4. And now pawn to b5, expanding on the queen side a little bit. You might see some bishop b7 action hitting the d5 pawn. And now you'll see pawn to b3. This is another idea we will see in some of these more flexible systems from black, where white will go pawn to b3 and go bishop to b2. We see pawn to c4 and a trade, and now the knight goes to f2. And here, black can try, they can try bishop takes f4, but it's a little inaccurate here. After bishop takes f4, white does get a tempo on this knight. They can go pawn to g3, bishop to g5, and c3, and the knight is hit. Knight has to move, and now queen g4 hitting the knight again, and knight goes to d6. White gets quite a bit of an advantage here because when black was generating that activity, white was a little behind in development, but because this knight is loose and they let white get this half move to slip in c3, white is caught up in the development, has some pressure, has some threats. Again, it's really hard to see where this light square bishop is going to go, and white does have a significant advantage here of +2. So instead of taking on f4 right away, black should be cautious of white catching up in development. It should just go knight f5 right away. And if white tries something like g3 trying to hold on, they can just continue with bishop b7, and now instead of focusing on f4, focus on d5. So there is an e5 try from black here. If after queen c7 and then knight d4 and a6, the bishop ends up on f1, the other try that black has is knight to g4, with the immediate threats of taking on f3, and then once you recapture, checkmate. So there's a threat here. You have to take care of the threat. We'll see pawn to g3. Now we'll see knight f3, queen f3, and knight e5, hitting the queen. Queen to e2 and pawn to e6, trying to maybe get in d5, maybe just open up a space for the bishop. So pawn to b3, we'll see this bishop to b2 idea yet again. Pawn to d6, not going for d5 right away. A problem with d5 is just that white takes and you can't take back because you have two attackers on e5, and this would lose a piece. So you can't go d5 right away. That's why you see d6 from black. And now bishop to b2, just furthering that plan of developing. Bishop to e7, bishop to g2, knight c6. You're getting this knight out of the way. That way d5 may become a possibility in the future. Also, maybe looking to jump in to d4 and hit the queen again. Knight to d1, knight to d4, queen to d3. Castles. Now we see pawn to c3 hitting this knight again. Knight to c6, queen e2. And the idea of queen e2 is that after black tries some move, they can break with d4 and get some space. And I think white is doing okay here. Again, I don't think this is significant advantage for white, but it's definitely very comfortable with this extra space. So this is one idea here. Okay, so let's back up. Let's see, that was queen c7, and that should cover most of these knight f6 lines. You should just go knight to c3, and you'll get some pretty standard development. Nothing too wild. I think the wildest line was the one we just looked at, where the queen ends up going to like e2 and d3 and then back to e2. But okay, those are our kind of sidelines, not the main moves here. And here, black does have other options. I should probably also mention d6 here before we move on. And I don't believe I covered knight d4 right away. Actually, I think I did. So let's go look at d6. Pawn to d6 is another move, but this is more of a transposition rather than its own line. This is going to transpose to some of those lines in the Moscow. White should castle, and then the reason it transposes to the Moscow is bishop to d7 here, just breaking the pin. But you'll see white just make normal moves. You have rook to e1. If black tries to kick this bishop right away, it's a little bit inaccurate. You can take on c6 and play d4, and you're already breaking in the center. Takes, knight f6, and now normally a Sicilian player who plays the open Sicilian would try something like knight to c3. This is a completely fine move, but I'm going to recommend the move bishop to g5. What is the point of this? Well, they can go e6 and then try and go bishop e7 and break the pin. I should note you can't really take on e4. If you take on e4, knight takes c6, hits the queen, so you have to take the knight, and then you win the knight in the center. If you take on e4 with the bishop, you take on f6 with your own bishop. There's no good square for black's bishop to go to. So they take on g2, and now after king takes g2 and pawn takes f6, white is up a piece here as well. So that's why I recommend bishop to g5. It's just there's a few more tricks, which is why black should play pawn to e6. And now after knight takes c6, bc6, it's hard to see why a6 helps black's position in the long run. And now you might see queen to f3, and the idea is you're looking to possibly capture on f6 twice. And here, if black plays, again, a little inaccurately, is pawn to e5, trying to stop any e5 ideas from white themselves. You just take on f6, and here, in this specific position, instead of taking on f6 and doubling the pawns, you have queen to c3, where you are hitting the c6 pawn, and now black has to play something like rook c8, and it's hard to see what the purpose of the rook is here other than purely defending the pawn. And black's play will be a little passive, and white has a significant advantage here. So black shouldn't just try and kick the bishop away right away. Those exchanges and opening the center does help white a little bit and does give them a lot of tricks to work with. If you're trying to avoid the tricks, you should try knight to f6 instead, more solid. Pawn to c3, and we'll see kind of what the pawn advance is in the Italian and the Ruy Lopez of pawn to c3 and pawn to d4. Now black can hit the bishop, and the bishop goes to f1. So if, again, if black has not committed their bishop to g7, if they haven't committed their center, you just drop back to f1. And now you might see bishop to g4 with this pin. It's not too big of a deal right now. You can go pawn to d4 and expand in the center anyway, and trade in the center. Now, if they capture on f3, you need to make sure you capture with the pawn. It looks scary because your king is exposed, but you always have king h1 and moving the bishop in the future, and you can put the rook on g1 and try and utilize that file for yourself, or if there's any immediate danger, your bishop is able to block on g2 and patch up that hole. But the reason you cannot take with the queen is because knight takes d4 and you're losing a center pawn, and this can be pretty rough, just losing a pawn like this. So if they do take, make sure you capture with the pawn. You're going to be all right. There's no quick attacks black has. The queen isn't out. The other bishop isn't out to try and attack your king. So it's no big problem yet. Pawn to d5 is a try by black. They can try pawn to e5 instead. And if they try pawn to e5, you just lock up the center. The knight can apply more pressure to f3, so this may scare some people. But bishop to e3, and after knight takes, the pawn takes. And again, this is not the worst position in the world for white. They always have king to h1, moving the bishop, and then getting the other rook to g1. And I believe this position was reached in a world championship game. I wish I could remember the names. I guess I forgot that citation tonight, but this position is okay. It's a little unclear who's going to be better overall, but this position is still playable for both sides. But like I said, they can try and go d5, and white should just lock up the center. No need to make trades. You can always just push and take the space. Space is good. Knight to d7, and now you play h3, hitting the bishop. If the bishop goes to h5, you're already running into some trouble after g4, and after bishop to g6, white just has some good space here. Again, we have this e6 idea, and here fe6, and now the rook can take as an idea, or just simply develop the rest of your pieces. Okay, so bishop can take on f3 because retreating can lead to complications after e6. After bishop takes f3, queen takes f3 here. It's a logical recapture. And after knight takes d4, you have the move queen to d1. So it looks like you're hanging this pawn, but after queen to d1, you're hitting the knight, and behind it is another pawn. So it's not the end of the world. Knight to c6. And here you can take on d5. This is fine. It leads to an equal position, but I'm going to recommend e6 here, again, because after fe6, you have just normal development, and taking with the rook on e6 later is an idea. and it can really make black suffer, particularly with developing their dark squared bishop. So if black delays too long with developing their pawns for their bishop, this e6 idea seems to be one that works. And here, a little exchange sacrifice. There really isn't, if you go back to e1, then black plays pawn to e6, and now all their pieces are going to develop. Their rook is going to get to the center. Their king is going to go back to g8 after the rook move, so they're castling by hand. And here black is really catching up, starting to get some activity. So one line that we're going to look at is rook takes f6, ef6, important to open up the diagonal for the bishop. And now knight d5 getting the center pawn. Pawn to b5 is an idea here, and in response is bishop to d3. And the idea is, even though this knight looks like it's hanging, you have this move bishop to g6, and then we just say we love tactics, because now the king has to take, or if the pawn takes, the queen is hanging. So always tricks in these positions. So bishop c5 instead, putting pressure on f2. And this position is a little bit better for white. They can go bishop f4 and continue with natural development. This rook is going to come to c1 and try and get the minor pieces. Why would you open his bishop with tempo with an exchange sacrifice? Because you're getting the center pawn. If you don't, you are not going to be winning this center pawn. So the idea is you're giving up this exchange, and even though it's opening up the bishop, you are getting this center pawn, and you're going to have easy development yourself. So that would be why. And white has a little bit of an advantage because of initiative. Because white is the one that has committed to the first capture, and black recaptures. White now gets a free move. They're going to take the pawn, and now after like b5, the reason why pawn to b5 is if you try something like rook to c8, queen to b3 is going to be hitting this backwards pawn. And now if you try b5, this isn't going to work because of tactics, discoveries. And now king g6 is the only move, and bishop d3 to follow. And you have to sacrifice your queen, otherwise you're getting checkmated. So that is why. You give up the exchange because you get a center pawn and some serious play. Okay. So that should cover a lot of these lines here. I believe that was our d6 move. And now we are going to get into some more theory. We're going to cover, let's cover the g6 lines, and we'll probably have to cover the e6 lines next week because I don't think we're going to have time for them. But this will be good. We still get a look at the main line, Rasalimo. The reason I'm going to do e6 separately is there's a bit more theory and it's a bit unique compared to all the other lines. But now we start getting into the real Rasalimo. I wanted to make sure we covered all of those side lines to make sure that we don't miss anything and you have an idea of what to do even if your opponent plays suspicious looking moves. So pawn to g6, and this is the main line Rasalimo, and white has two options to play here. They can either castle or they can take on c6. We are going to look at takes on c6 first because it's not played as much. And here, if black plays g6, taking on c6 is even more attractive. And the reason why is black is loosening their pawn structure a little bit with pawn to g6. You start to see some holes appear on the dark squares. And then also, black is going to have to spend some time maneuvering the bishop to g7 while the knight remains on g8. And if white can play d4 fast enough, then black may just have holes that are too serious that can be taken advantage of. But with careful play, white should maintain equality. Or sorry, black should maintain equality. So here we see the d-pawn take. And this is for the same reasons that the d-pawn took in some of the lines we looked at earlier, is because when you take with the d-pawn, it helps your light square bishop develop. Again, if you take with the b-pawn, your light square bishop isn't going to be too particularly happy on a6 after d3, and it would be better playing d6 anyway. So might as well just get the d-pawn out of the way now, save yourself a little bit of time. Now with the queen staring right here at the d-file, we're going to play d3 and just build a solid pawn chain, open up the diagonal for our bishop to develop. This knight is going to go to c3 or d2. Castle short is good. Let's take a look at some more specific moves. Bishop to g7. This is the point of g6. And here you can castle here. This is fine. But a little more accurate is going to be pawn to h3, and this is just making sure black cannot play bishop to g4. This pin can be a little annoying. Like if they play, I guess whites can try and play c3. If they try and play c3 to stunt the bishop, something like bishop to g4 can be a little annoying because let's say if you try and go knight d2 right away, you're already hanging a pawn on d3, so it's going to require a little bit more attention from white. Pawn to h3, and let's say captures on f3 twice. Knight to f6, and castles. White is going to have fine development for sure. This bishop can't really go to e3 because you're going to hang your d-pawn currently. But this is probably going to be more of an equal position. I don't see the advantage white gets out of this. I think better is just to play h3 and deny them the chance of going bishop g4 and getting any sort of play. Knight to f6, getting prepared to castle, and knight to c3. This knight may end up going to e2 and g3 in the future. It could just be there to help support the e4 point. But we see black castle here, bishop to e3, and this is hitting the pawn on c5, so that is why we're going to see black play pawn to b6. And here, white just continues queen to d2 with natural development, and black goes pawn to e5. Now, some of you guys who are in the chat may notice that the pawn on e5 looks like it's hanging. So I'm going to give you guys a quick second here to see what a problem may be with taking this pawn. Why would black be okay with giving away a pawn and maybe more importantly a center pawn? Because of knight takes e4, Eternal 1212 coming in with the answer. So if you take on e5, just like Eternal said, knight takes e4, and if you take on e4, bishop takes on e5, and this is equalization right away. So if you're trying to be a bit more complicated, you take on f7 first, you trade off queens, and then here knight to c4. If black is going to lose this knight anyway, the reason why black moves it to c4 is that way it forces white to recapture and loosen their pawns a little bit. And now after rook takes d8, this is again is equal. There's not much here where white is much greater. And if black really wanted to, instead of rook to d8, or sorry, not instead of rook to d8, here after rook to d8, white can try something like castles. Black can even be tempted by the idea of bishop c3 and bc3, and white has tripled pawns, and here we actually see almost the entire c-file filled up by pawns. So a bit of a funny line. Here, white is still fine. It's not like black can attack these pawns immediately, but it's not something you should be proud of. But yes, you can't really take on e5 because of knight to e4. So instead of going for it, if your opponent plays this against you, just play solidly, and the move you should play is bishop to h6. This is looking to trade off the dark square bishops, where this dark square bishop can be a great defender in this fianchetto setup. But let's see, we have another question in the chat. Eterno's asking, doesn't the bishop pair favor black as the 3-2 pawn majority is too close to the king? Let's see. Is this back in this line? Yeah, so like black doesn't need to take on c3. Black should probably just let it sit and not give up the bishop pair for no reason. But it was just an example. You know, at the amateur level, taking on c3 is completely fine and playable. But yeah, this bishop doesn't need to trade itself off. Good question. Like I said, the move you should try and play is bishop to h6, trying to trade off the dark square bishops. And black now goes queen to d6. They do not need to take on h6 and invite white's queen down to party with the black king. Instead, you go queen to d6, and the idea is that you are protecting the e5 pawn, because after some of these trades, this e5 pawn may actually be hanging, and it's best just to defend it, be solid, and further your development, because now after the light square bishop develops, your rooks are connected, and you're good to put those on open files. We see takes on g7 twice, and now castles, and rook to e8, again, supporting the pawn on e5. And now we will see white, they don't really have much progress to make on the king side, so we'll see them expand on the queen side and try and take space over there, where after pawn to a5, stopping this a4 pawn, we get pawn to b3, just creating another chain, keeping it solid. Knight to h5, coming into f4, and now knight to e2. That way, if the knight comes to f4, we just trade it off, and it's not going to be a big deal for white. And here, a move like f6, just, again, solidifying e5. You're not really adding any weaknesses to your position here, and this is a pretty equal position. So that is, that's kind of what happens if white takes on c6 after g6, where, you know, black won't really, or what am I saying? Just forget I said anything. We're going to move on. After g6, the other option white has is just to castle right away. And they don't need to take on c6 right away. And like I said, both of them are good moves, but castles is played a little bit more at the top level. And here we will just see bishop to g7. What happens if black tries and kicks this bishop? Well, then we do want to trade, because this is the point of playing bishop b5 in the first place. You take this knight to get rid of some of that center control black has, and if they ever play a6 like this very early on, just take on c6, because there's really no benefit for black. Why is black forcing you to do something you want to do already? There's no benefit of playing a6. You know, after like b takes, this doesn't help. After d takes, I don't see why a6 is played. Why couldn't she play something more active like bishop g7 instead? We have Jean-Michel Royer, I hope I'm saying that right, is asking the bishop trade on g7. Is it a good idea for white? And this is back in the lines we just looked at, where black fianchettoed the bishop, and then white went bishop h6. Yes, I have to say that's a good idea. The bishop on g7 is a very powerful piece, one of the main defenders of the fianchetto pawn structure. So once you trade off those dark square bishops, it does create some dark square weaknesses that hopefully the queen and the knight can try and get on. And rushing the h-pawn up to hit g6 is also an idea. But examples of that are going to be best found in probably the Yugoslav dragon, where you see this fianchetto structure. So I recommend you to go see our Yugoslav video that we've done a few months ago, actually probably a year ago now. But it was a while ago. I did that. It gives some better examples of trading on g7. Okay, but back to this line. Oh yeah, I was saying why a6 is bad. They should just go bishop g7. It's going to be more active, contribute more to the overall position, more than a6 is ever going to. And here we do reach another fork where white has two options. They can go pawn to c3, and this is trying to close off and strengthen our weak diagonal, where after something like knight to f6, there's two options here. There is rook to e1 and e5. We'll look at e5 first. It's a little bit more dubious because the knight just goes to d5, and we start seeing that black has more pieces developed than white. You're going to have to go d4 to get space in the center, try and make up for your lack of development. You have to get this bishop out somehow. A trade in the center, castles, knight c3, and again, we're going to see this idea of knight to c7 hitting the bishop. And here, I do want to mention if knight takes c6, or sorry, knight c3, pawn takes c3, and after d6, ed6, queen d6, and a4, it's hard to see what black has gained out of taking on c6. I think it's better to maintain some tension, keep some pieces on the board, and threaten this bishop on b5. And we just let it sit there. Rook to e1, knight takes b5, knight takes b5, d6. These moves are all pretty forced because they're captures. Take on d6 with pawn now. You can't take with the queen because the knight on b5 is protecting. And black is going to end up with this isolated queen's pawn that may or may not turn out to be a weakness. But this is going to be one of the things that is in the fight for the game. We'll see the knight go to e5. And this is kind of your starting position if black tries and plays, or sorry, if white tries to play e5. The other idea here, like I said, after c3 and knight f6, the other idea is rook to e1, and this is just protecting the pawn. This is probably more straightforward for beginners. I have another question in chat from Eterno1212. Will the e6 variation be covered today with black intending on playing knight e7 and a6? We will not have the time to cover those lines today, but I do plan on covering them next week. So if you're interested in the e6 variation, which is a bit more unique, has probably more theory than the g6 lines, but like I said, that's what we're going to be covering next week. But back to the g6 line. The other idea after c3 and knight f6 is rook e1. Like I said, probably more straightforward, directly protecting the pawn. Black castles, and now we see white go h3. This is to get around any d6 and bishop g4 ideas, stopping the knight from coming in. And now pawn to e5. So you'll see black play pawn to e5 quite a bit, trying to stop white from pushing their own pawn, avoid getting that tempo on the knight. But here after e5, white still has enough protectors on d4 to play pawn to d4 anyway. We see a lot of captures, and I should mention, this knight on c6 captures first, because if you capture with the pawn, there is the idea of bishop takes on c6, and this may, black may not like this idea. It should be fine for them, but this is one of the reasons why taking with the other knight first. You also get this tempo on the bishop, which encourages white to trade knights as well. E takes, queen takes, and d5. e5 is here, knight to e4. And now knight to c3, we see a trade on c3. And after queen c7, this position's pretty equal as well, and this will be your starting position after c3, knight f6, and rook e1. Instead of going c3, the main move here after bishop to g7 is rook to e1. Again, just directly protecting the pawn. And here black has two tries. There's a lot of forks very early on, and it seems like on every move here. But we'll look at e5 here. e5 is the common idea. So what happens if black tries to play it a little early? There's two tries by white here, but I'm going to go over what I think is the better try. Is bishop takes c6, dc6, and now pawn to d3, queen e7, knight to d2. Some standard developing moves. Now, in the other lines we looked at, this knight went to c3. I should clarify why it's going to d2 in this line. It's actually on its way to c4, where it's going to help put pressure on e5. And it's going to be very hard for black to just kick it away. I guess they can try and go b5, but knight e3 is a pretty good central square for that knight. So we see knight to f6, just normal development, getting prepared to castle. Knight to c4, putting the pressure. Knight to d7, and this is adding yet another defender to the pawn. Bishop to d2, castles, and here a3, b6 is equal. Maybe white has a little bit of an advantage because bishop c3 is coming, and e5 is a target, but I don't think it's anything to write home about. But this is probably going to be white's try if black goes e5 early. Otherwise, black should just go knight f6. Again, continue developing their pieces, looking for activity. Okay, I need to make sure I am getting the correct lines here. Now white goes c3 here. This is definitely a try here. They can try going knight to c3. If they go knight to c3, you're just going to see more of the standard moves from both sides. You're going to see white hit with e5, forcing this knight back to e8, and then they're just going to continue with knight c3, h3, pawn to d3, and we see this knight e4 maneuver again. But that is a try with knight to c3. I also want to make sure I cover e5. This is probably white's most aggressive try against the Rasalimo, this main line here. The knight goes to d5. We've seen this idea before. Knight to c3, knight to c7. We should be familiar with these ideas now. And here, if knight takes, in the other line, I believe it was the b pawn that took, but here the d pawn takes is just going to be killer because this bishop is not going to have much hope on this a1 to h8 diagonal. So you see knight to c7 hitting the bishop, and here you can take on c6, and knight e4. And here there's some very strong attacking chances for this knight on e4, even like temporarily sacrificing it on f6 if black makes a nothing move. Knight to f6 check is actually a good candidate move because after like pawn takes, then pawn takes comes with check. You see king f8 and you win this bishop on g7. And white has a bit of a plus here because of all the time that it took for the king to move. He should be fine here. b3 and bishop b2 is going to come, and black is going to have to react to this. So this is probably the most aggressive try. So instead of allowing knight to f6 as an option, we see knight to e6 closing off the file. Pawn to d3 castles, bishop e3, more of these standard moves. b6 to protect the attacked pawn. Queen d2, just connecting the rooks. Knight to d4, and we see a trade of knights, and this bishop to h6 idea again. And here, pawn to c5, just to kind of solidify. And here, white just has a little tiny advantage. Again, you're not going to see all the attacking chances and big chances white has compared to the open Sicilian, but if you're looking for something solid, the Rasalimo is going to be it. Now, instead of e5, we'll finish up here with the main line c3. And after c3, we see black castle, pawn to h3, and there's two moves here for black. We'll start with queen to b6, which is a little inaccurate, but is actually pretty cool because we see something that almost resembles a King's Indian defense. I'm not going to explain these moves too much because we are running out of time, but I want to show it off. Is when you save the bishop, you see a few pawn moves. The bishop comes back to b3, just kind of eyeing this f7 square, inviting the knight to come to a5, and then you move the bishop again. You lose the tempo, but it's not like black has anything crazy they can try right away. You'll see both sides develop their pieces, and then after black expands here on the queen side, you'll see white expand in the center. And the reason this reminds me a lot of the King's Indian is especially black's setup here, where you will eventually see knight to e8 and an f5 try. So you might see like knight to h2, and if f5, f3, and then if you see f4, bishop f2. These are not the best moves. White does have a good plus here, but this is just an example. You can try and get transpositions to the King's Indian. I believe this is going to be a bit better for white than the normal King's Indian, but these transpositions do exist where the plans radically change. But instead of queen b6, where it's a little dubious, just because that position may lead to a better one for white, the better try is pawn to e5, and white should not go for this capture on c6, trying to win the center pawn. There are going to be some issues after rook to e8, and now after knight to f3, your e-pawn is hanging. So again, don't be too tempted to take this pawn on e5. In most of these lines, it can be poison. So if you are going to try and go for it, just double check your calculations. Make sure black doesn't have any resource to either pick up a pawn or get some serious counterplay. So instead of e5, just go with d4, focus on breaking in the center, developing your pieces. You'll see c takes. We'll see the knight take again. After knight takes, e takes, queen takes. We get our position from earlier, and this transposes, I guess, the main line. One of our side lines transposes into this main line, where here we see pawn to e5, the knight to e4, knight to c3, we see a trade, and queen to c7. Like I said, this is going to be kind of your starting position. Good starter move would be bishop to a3, hitting the rook, rook to d8, bishop to d3, just bringing it back, trying to regroup your pieces, bishop to e6, rook a to c1, rook a to c8, and this is going to be your main starting position of the main line. So I want to thank everyone for stopping in tonight. Definitely a lot of theory. This has been the most theory-heavy Openings Explained lecture that I've given recently. Next week, we are going to cover the e6 lines in the Rasalimo, so watch out for part 2 coming next week. This was Chess Openings Explained. I'm Nick Risco. I will see you next time.